Oh, greetings, David. It is really a pleasure and a delight for all of us to have you here. Because your books have been translated into Spanish, many of the people in our community have had access to your perspective. And I know for many of them, there'll be questions that they have after engaging with your thought that I hope that I can give voice to here. So thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really delighted to join you and looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. So I was leading a Buddhist retreat earlier this year in Mexico, in which we explored interdependence and spiritual awakening or bodhicitta in terms of responding to climate crisis,
Mm.
species extinction, and ecological injustices, as well as gender and racial justice. And while it was clear that many of those present did have a commitment and were inspired by a vision of spiritual practice in which ecological and social justice has a central place. One of the students with many years in the Dharma sought me out to tell me in a very respectful way that I might consider that there were people in the retreat who felt that had they wanted to hear about climate and ecological crises, they would not have gone to a Buddhist retreat. And this comment served me well because
Mm.
it obliged me to make a much clearer case for why Buddhist communities should consider these central to their practice. You've been making a case for the integration of Buddhism with ecology and social justice concerns for a long time. Could you share how you might have responded or how you might respond to people's skepticism that addressing ecological, gender, social justice really belongs at the center of Buddhist practice?
What a great question and an interesting question. Thank you for it. Yeah. The first thing to say, I think, is we need to think about what we mean by Buddhism, right? This is one of the issues of language. We have a word Buddhism, and presumably it corresponds to something. But when we remember basic Buddhist teachings about impermanence and insubstantiality, we realize that the world isn't a collection of separate things, including Buddhism, right? But it's a kind of confluence of processes. And the reason I mention this is it's really important for the way that we understand Buddhism. Rather than thinking of it as one tradition, I, I mean, for part of one answer, of course, is that there's more than one type of Buddhism. And certainly they're connected, but they can't be reduced to a common denominator without sort of losing sort of valuable things. But also understanding how Buddhism from the beginning has been in process, uh, transformative, just like everything else. So when we think about Buddhism going to China or Tibet, my own practice tradition is Zen Buddhism, Japanese Zen, and of course that comes from China, Chan Buddhism. But the Buddha never taught Chan or Zen, right? That's what evolved kind of naturally when Mahayana Buddhism went to China. And it turned out that the reason it caught on so well is because there was this resonance with uh, the indigenous traditions of China, especially Taoism. And we say in Zen that it's really a result of the interaction between Mahayana and Taoism. Sometimes it's said uh, Buddhism is the father of Chan Zen, and Taoism is the mother. So that reminds us.
Mhm.
And there's lots of other examples. Think about Tibetan Buddhism, right? The Buddha didn't teach Tibetan Buddhism, but when Tantric Buddhism from India went to Tibet and interacted with the indigenous Bon tradition, that's what created Tibetan Buddhism. So this is really important that Buddhism doesn't just sort of impose itself, but it's a living tradition that sort of interacts. And of course, right now, there's this great challenge. Buddhism comes to the modern West, certainly the greatest challenge, the most different um, culture, civilization that Buddhism has ever experienced, and not only modernity with the emphasis on growing secularism, but also you think about modern technologies and all modern ways of knowing. So basically what I'm saying is I think as Buddhism comes to the West and interacts, that is not that we're giving up Buddhism in some way, but that Buddhism, certain faces of Buddhism that maybe weren't developed in the same way in other traditions, are going to come out and be further developed. Going back to, say, the Buddha, the life of the Buddha, insofar as we know about it, it's pretty clear, I think, if we read the Pali Canon, that the Buddha was somewhat more progressive than the institution that developed after he died. I mean, if you look at his attitude toward women and toward caste, I think that shows a kind of social sensitivity or insight, right? I mean, the situation of women at the time of the Buddha in the Vedic tradition was pretty bad. They were not allowed to practice. They could get in a lot of trouble. And yet the Buddha created a bhikkhuni sangha, a sangha for women based on the realization that women have the same Buddha nature, the same potential to wake up as men. That was a pretty radical thing to do. And the same thing with caste, of course, when you join the either one of those orders, the bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, the monks or the nuns, you lost caste and you really weren't supposed to focus on that. So I see built into that the implication that there was a lot of social sensitivity on the part of the Buddha. And yet, once he was gone, I think the institution, in order to survive and thrive, it wanted royal support. It wanted commercial support from the merchants. It lost some of its radical edge, and as you know better than me, the women's sangha, the bhikkhuni sangha, disappeared in many places, and likewise the concern to get royal support involved, well, you know how it works. If you want royal support, if you want to be supported by the powers that be, you'd better support the powers that be. And so basically what this meant is that any kind of political thrust that might challenge those powers that be, the kings and the emperors and so forth, that would intrinsically basically that I think that got weeded out pretty early because and as a result, I think Buddhism, in order to as I said, survive and thrive, the focus became very much on the individual's own karma, the individual's own awakening. But I don't see it as necessarily the case that that's all that Buddhism has to be concerned about. That has to do with the way that Buddhism developed in a culture that was pre-modern, that was non-democratic. And, you know, Buddhism did what it needed to turn into a successful religion. Now, that's part of one answer. The other rather different type of answer that I think is pretty important here, especially when we look at something like the ecological crisis, it really seems to me that it's the same problem that Buddhism has always talked about, at least on the individual level. That you could say fundamentally the issue at the core of our ignorance and delusion is the delusion of a discrete, separate self that's separate from the world that it's in. And so this sense of separation or duality, in a way, is the fundamental issue. That's one way to express the teachings. But I think there's a parallel with the larger. So, you know, unlike the Abrahamic traditions, where the emphasis is on God and especially ethics, right? The idea that there's a moral code and that's how you qualify for heaven. For Buddhism, the fundamental issue, although morality is important, right? We have precepts and all that, but for Buddhism, the fundamental issue is delusion. There's something that we need to realize. There's something that we need to experience. And that's the whole idea of enlightenment or awakening, is to realize the true nature of the world and the true nature of ourselves right here and now, rather than, trying to qualify for some kind of immortality after we die. So because Buddhism emphasizes delusion, there's different ways that plays out, but we can say that at the core of the delusion is this feeling that there's a David inside, maybe behind the eyes or inside the ears, that I'm in here and you and the rest of the world is outside. And the Buddhist teaching of anatta, no self, along with the other Buddhist teaching about interdependence, that emphasizes that, right, we're not separate from each other, but that we're profoundly connected, and that the sense of separation is really not only delusive, but causes a lot of suffering, because the sense of self is a construct, to use modern language. It's inherently, because it doesn't have any separate reality of its own, it's inherently, I think, uncomfortable, and a lot of dukkha, a lot of suffering uh, comes out of that discomfort and the ways that we try to deal with it, overcome it. So the parallel I wanted to make was, if we understand the fundamental Buddhist teaching as emphasizing that sense of non-duality, that we're not separate from the world, it seems to me the ecological crisis at its core, it's a larger version of the same problem, that we as a species, as a now modern, really one international civilization, pretty much, that we nonetheless feel that we are separate from the earth, that the earth is there as a source of raw materials to be exploited, as a dump, but we don't have this sense of identification with it. We don't have the sense that we are expressions of it. And insofar as we think that our own well-being can be separated from the well-being of the planet, well, the whole ecological crisis is really just a refutation of that, I think, collective delusion.
One angle of vision that you've explored extensively in your books is the way in which Buddhism does, as you've just mentioned, a much better job in general at focusing on and resolving individual suffering. As you say, pulling one person at a time out of the river of suffering. Um, where do you see the roots of this individual focus in Buddhism historically and in the ways that it's currently being transmitted? And what Buddhist teachings and practices contribute to this individualist orientation?
Hmm. Well, in a way, that's another side to what I was just talking about. Um, I started talking about the the attitude of the Buddha himself. But if you think about the Buddha's life, and for me, this is sort of my all-time favorite story. Okay, he goes out and he works with a couple teachers, he has friends and community, but ultimately, guess what? He goes off and he meditates by himself, and his awakening is by himself, and then he comes back to the world and starts to teach and help other people. But I think built into this fundamental story is a kind of individualism that then becomes emphasized in the way that Buddhism also thinks about something like karma, right? Karma too is individual. Each of us is experiencing the results of what we've done in past lifetimes. But again, it's curious. On the one hand, Buddhism emphasizes interdependence, but at the same time, if you look at the way karma has traditionally been understood, it's very much my karma is my suffering because of what I did in my past lifetime. And that's kind of dangerous in the sense that whenever there's a situation, when someone is suffering, it's sort of, well, it's your own fault. I mean, what I have in mind here is I've heard Buddhist teachers say, and I'm not going to mention their names, but one in particular say that, oh, what terrible karma all those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born at that time. And I can understand how that comes out of the way that the teaching of karma is traditionally understood, but I don't accept it. I mean, to say, in a way, it's their own fault that they created their own destiny. I think that's exactly what we need to start questioning, insofar as we understand. We need to realize there are social forces. You could be the nicest person in Europe, and if you're a Jew, and you're likely to get caught up in some very ugly things that are happening, and you'll be lucky to survive. So uh, I think that's an example of how Buddhism has, what am I saying, encouraged a certain kind of individualism. I mean, it's definitely there, and yet, as I tried to say earlier, there's also, I think, this possibility um, that um, historical developments are now opening up, especially now that we have democracies, or at least nominal democracies in the sense of free speech. We don't have to cater to kings and emperors and so forth. And we can, as a result, sort of challenge, question the social order, the economic system, the political system. And insofar as those are causes, massive causes of dukkha, I think that that's a really important part of how it is that Buddhism now needs to develop.
Mhm. So given this need to develop in a way that allows us to be addressing the social forces that have such an important place and the collective forms of suffering, how do you propose that Buddhism make that shift to address, for example, structural violence?
In a couple different ways. I mean, I think that the teachings need to be expanded. For example, we can go back to um, the the three roots of evil, or the three fires: greed, ill will, delusion. I mean, this is a really good example of what I've been talking about. That if you go back to the Pali Canon, the earliest teachings, uh, they're always understood on individual levels, right? It's karma is a matter of dealing with your greed and the consequences of your own greed, your own ill will, your own delusion. What I think is important today is to expand the teachings and to realize the sense in which those three poisons have become structural. They've been institutionalized. Frankly, if you look, I mean, if greed means you never have enough, I think that's a pretty good description of our economic system at the moment. It's not simply that consumers never have enough, but corporations are never profitable enough, market share never big enough, stock prices never high enough. This tendency to grow, in fact, if our economic system doesn't grow, it tends to collapse, right? But as I like to ask, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? This need to sort of build and build, and especially on a finite planet, on an Earth of very limited resources, it seems to me there's inevitably going to be a clash between this institutionalized greed to grow and grow and the limits of the biosphere. And I think that's one way of understanding the origin of the ecological crisis. I mean, that's one example, but we can extend it. Look at institutionalized ill will. Sometimes that's translated as anger or hatred, but I think it's sort of negativity in general. And if you look at the world's militarism, and how, well, okay, both of us are here in the United States, and uh, if it's measured by the amount of money that we put into it, right? The American military machine is the biggest, the greatest, the most powerful, and uh, absorbing more resources than any other military ever has in the history of the earth. And of course, what goes along with that is if you have that kind of military, you're going to tend to sort of throw it around once in a while, and you want to use it to promote your own foreign policy goals and to get the resources that you think you need. That's another example, I think. I mean, we can also look at institutionalized racism of police forces, etc. And then institutionalized delusion. It used to be that and this is pre-Trump, that I would focus on advertising as a way of sort of keeping us persuaded that at the core of our dissatisfaction is, we don't have enough. So advertising kind of programming us. It's always the next thing we buy that's going to make us happy, make us fulfilled. And there's definitely an important point there, how much I think advertising contributes to a kind of worldview of consumerism. And frankly, if I kind of sit back and look at the world, it seems to me the most successful widespread religion today is consumerism. If consumerism is understood as, how what's really important about the world and how to live in the world, I think that's the most successful religion of all time. But in addition to the whole consumerism problem, I mean, now, as we know from the last decade or so, this explosion of fake news, the fact that the internet and other media are now people have figured out how to exploit it to promote their own purposes. And of course, the whole phenomenon of Trump, I think is one product of that. It's hard to imagine Trump without Fox News and the kind of things that it was promoting for so long. So basically, what I'm saying is, one thing we need to do is to just wake up to the fact that greed, ill will, delusion are not simply problems on an individual level, but there's also collective versions which are causing lots of suffering. And then that raises the question how we're going to deal with them. The other issue that I think is really important, well, two things. First of all, to follow up on what I just said, I think we do have a fundamental Buddhist teaching. In fact, I think, frankly, it's the single most important Buddhist teaching for us today that enables us to follow up on what I just said about structural greed, will, delusion. And it's simply the bodhisattva path, or as I sometimes like to describe it, the new bodhisattva path, or insofar as we apply it to the ecological crisis, the ecosattva path. Right? What's really, really important about the bodhisattva path is that there's a double practice, that one continues to work on one's own delusion, one's own mind, one's own awakening, whatever one's practice may be. But there's also the realization that, hey, that's not enough, especially when we realize that we're not separate from other people. There's a kind of an irony here that I think probably all of us come to Buddhism in the first place because there's some sense of personal dissatisfaction with our own lives, right? Our own lives aren't working as well as we would like them to. There's some problem. And so we get the sense that by meditation, we can get a better sense, understand better how our own minds work, etc. The interesting thing about that, once we come to Buddha's practice and start to meditate, what we sooner or later realize is what I was alluding to or referring to earlier, that the fundamental delusion, the fundamental problem for me and for everyone is my ego. Ego here in the sense of the delusion of a separate self whose well-being, my well-being is separate from yours and separate from everyone else's, separate from the world's. That in a way that sooner or later, I think we see that sense of separation and self-centeredness is actually at the core of the problem. And insofar as we really get a clear handle on that, then I think it naturally opens up to something like the bodhisattva path. We realize our own well-being isn't separate from the well-being of others because we're not separate from them. We're not separate from society or from the world. And also, even more so, I would say, how, let me put it this way. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's the example of the great yogi Milarepa, right? Who sort of walled himself in a cave. I think his skin turned green from eating nettles, if I remember correctly. And supposedly meditating by himself in that cave, he went all the way to Buddhahood in one lifetime. At least that's the way it's sometimes expressed. I have my doubts. Maybe there are cases where it works like that, but I think Joanna Macy is onto something when she says the world has a role to play in our own awakening. Um, I remember when I started Zen practice in Hawaii. I first lived in the Maui Zendo, a pretty nice place to practice, as you might imagine. It was small, and it certainly wasn't very Japanese, and we were all basically hippies, young hippies. But we took the practice very seriously, and things happened. There were openings, what we call kensho in Japanese Zen, um, and in fact, those happened pretty naturally. But what I think many of us found more challenging, certainly in my case, it's one thing to have an awakening of any sort, or let's just say an insight about yourself and how you're relating to the world, what the world is. It's one thing to have a kind of insight. Oh, it's something very different to integrate that insight into how we actually live and relate to other people. That's much more of a challenge. So what's Milarepa doing in that cave? Who is he? You know, it's like getting out in society is part of our practice. What did Ramdas say? So you think you're enlightened? Well, go spend the holidays with your family, right? See where you're stuck. See where how you fall back into old patterns because people see you in a way that maybe you aren't anymore. It's like the challenge of dealing with other people is part of our own transformation, and it shows us where we're still stuck. So that interaction is essential, and I think it's essential to how we understand the bodhisattva path. The person who benefits most from the from following the bodhisattva path is the bodhisattva herself or himself, because that's part of integrating that concern to contribute what we can to making the world a better place. That's how we deeply transform ourselves, these old self-centered, self-preoccupied habits. What's in it for me? How we transform that is, oh, here we are we're all this common world. What can I do? What can we do together to make this a better place for all of us? So once you bring in the three poisons and understand the structural institutional side, I think it gives this new dimension to the bodhisattva path. The other thing that I would add, though, is, and I think this follows, traditionally, if we think about the bodhisattva path, it's mostly been understood on the individual level, individuals helping other individuals, right? Um, what I think we need to realize today is, in order to address the kinds of institutionalized problems we actually have to have much stronger sanghas, much stronger communities than have had. I mean, if you think, I guess I can only speak for Zen practice, but so often in a Zen center, right, people will come together for a sesshin, a retreat, and maybe they come from different places. They don't necessarily know each other, but there's no talking, right? You're not even supposed to look people in the eye. Uh, Everyone is meditating intently. Uh, there would probably be a Dharma talk by the teacher, maybe Each person has an opportunity for one-on-ones with the teacher. And then at the very end, what happens, there's a closing ceremony and you drink tea. Maybe you have a few words with the people sitting next to you, and then people go home. Well, without denigrating the value of those kinds of retreats, again, that focus on individual transformation isn't helping to create the kinds of communities that we need. So what I'm really suggesting is, of the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we have lots of teachers. We have lots of teachings. I mean, the literature, the podcasts, etc., huge. But I think where we're weakest at is Sangha, especially now that Western Buddhism is mostly non-monastic. It's this constant challenge of how do we create Sangha? And again, it's interesting. Sorry, I know I'm going on quite a bit here, but
Oh, please do.
one thing worth adding here is what creates Sangha? And basically, it's doing something together. I remember when I came back, I lived in Japan a long time, came back, I was teaching in Cincinnati for a while. And we started a Buddhist Peace Fellowship group. And what really made us gel was that we all did something together. We went to Washington for an anti-war activity, big march demonstration. And it was just the act of doing it, was really, I think, quite profound in the sense that, it really reinforced our sense of relationship, of brotherhood, sisterhood, community. So, what's going to create sanghas? It's not that you wait for a sangha and then do something, but I think there's a kind of a give and take, that it's important for people to do what they can, and in that way, I think the sanghas will naturally evolve. I'm sorry, I'm giving you very long answers to your questions here, but I think they're all kind of connected.
Absolutely, very much so. One phrase that I believe you coined it, I certainly know that you've developed it, is the term lack project.
Mm.
And to me, that's a very useful way of thinking about how to scaffold up, or how we do scaffold up from a sense of separation, a feeling of lack, to the large scale, society extractivist paradigms that are operative in our world today. Could you talk a little bit about your use of that term and how that could help us understand what's going on here?
Sure, although I guess I need to give a little history behind it. There was a period in my late 30s, early 40s, when I became very preoccupied with death, uh, at least intellectually, reading everything I could on it. And perhaps, and including the Buddhist literature, but in many ways, what struck me most deeply were a couple books by this existential psychologist named Ernest Becker. And basically what he was talking about is how most of us are terrified of death, and so we tend to repress it because we don't know how to cope with it, but it comes out in kind of compulsive ways. It's a very psychoanalytic notion, the idea of repression, that if you repress your fear of death, it will come out indirectly. One example that I think is good for an academic like me is, maybe I know I'm going to die, but then I become sort of frantic, manic about writing some great book that will survive. At least David Loy's name will survive, right? My degrees are all in philosophy. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and David Loy. Wow, that's a way of sort of symbolic immortality, right? Anyway, it comes out different ways, different people. But when I looked at that from a Buddhist perspective, it seemed to me it was a little different. It's not so much that we're terrified about death, although we are, but there's a more profound problem right here and now, that this separate self called David Loy, that it basically doesn't have any separate reality, that my sense of who I am, it's a psychological and social construct. It's the way that mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting work together. But here's where it really gets powerful because the sense of self is a construct, it doesn't have any reality of its own. And that means it's inherently uncomfortable. It's inherently ungrounded. Um, the sense of self is not only ungrounded, but it's ungroundable in that form. And I think the way that we normally experience that is as a sense of lack, as the feeling that something is wrong with me, something is missing, isn't quite right, I'm not good enough. Uh, and frankly, I think that pretty much all of us have that at one level or another. Uh, in fact, it's interesting when I talk about this and I ask people to raise their hands. I mean, everyone recognizes this in ourselves. Where the problem comes is that we don't really understand how this is motivating us, that we have this sense of lack, but we're conditioned maybe by our culture to understand what it is we lack, right? What's really wrong with me? Well, I don't have enough money, right? I don't have enough consumer toys. That's a big one in Western, especially American culture. Um, uh, but it can come out in other ways. I'm not famous enough. I'm not powerful enough, etc. But I call these lack projects because at some level they're motivated by this sense of lack and the sense that, oh, if only I had enough of X, whatever X is, then I'll be okay. Then I'll feel okay. The irony being, of course, that uh, because becoming preoccupied with making money, because that's just a symptom of the fundamental problem. What it means is if that's what's motivating your drive for wealth, well, guess what? You're never going to be rich enough. You're never going to be famous enough. You're never going to be, David Loy is never going to be sexy enough or whatever, right? Or um, so there's a real tragedy built in here. Interestingly, I think that we can look upon Buddhism too as a kind of a reality project, but I think what's distinctive about it is that it's a reality project that can work in the sense that if we practice, we can begin to see through our reality projects and see how um, our mind is stuck in certain types of ways and let go. You know,
Mhm.
because the sense of lack is the shadow um, that haunts the sense of a separate self. If we can address the sense of separate self, which is what we're doing in Buddhist practice, right? Then in a way, we're also addressing the sense of lack that we won't be motivated by it in the same way. At least there's that possibility.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. So you've written of ways in which Buddhist teachings need to be brought into dialogue with other forms of knowledge, including science, to properly address the needs of our times. And I think many of us who are attracted to Buddhism may bring with us a kind of disgust or despair of the world that global capitalism has created. And often this manifests or is reframed in Buddhist communities as a contempt for, everything that Western civilization has created. And sometimes, that is encouraged because it strengthens the conviction in Buddhism, which is not coming from a European or North American context, right? And, also we have the other factor that you described in the beginning, which is that any tradition that is surviving millennia that comes from an enlightened founder is going to have a very strong conservative bent, conservative in the sense of conserving wisdom that comes from the past, and conservative in the sense of not making waves for the society around it. And all of this can make it very difficult to take an approach in Buddhist communities where Buddhism or Buddhisms are something that can be questioned, revised, and that could have something to learn from other traditions. And I'm asking this question from where we are as a community, which is within Buddhism, within Tibetan Buddhism, where more and more legal cases and allegations against Buddhist teachers, allegations of abuse and legal cases of abuse against Buddhist teachers have been emerging.
Mm.
And our community has been working to acknowledge and address the conditions that allow sexual abuse to take place in Buddhist communities, as something that urgently needs to be done, this sort of bringing things out of the shadow into the light, you could call it that way, something that urgently needs to be done if Buddhism is going to remain honored and valued in its new global context. And this also brings up a lot of defensiveness and resistance to seeing Buddhist organizations or teachers as flawed in any way. And so I just would like to invite you to, to explore whether that resonates with your experience, and also just say a bit about, why you believe that Buddhism or Buddhisms need to be integrated with other forms of knowledge.
Mm. Well, wow, there's a lot built into that multifaceted question. Yeah. When we, to go back to what I said at the very beginning, when we understand Buddhism as itself impermanent and insubstantial, and bring in the Buddhist emphasis on interdependence, I mean, I think what that implies for Buddhism itself is a kind of porosity that, in terms of being interacting with other traditions, including those of modernity. I can understand this deep-rooted human tendency to believe that, my own teacher, my own tradition, that this is perfect, that this is everything I need, and to kind of close off. I can understand how at a certain point one needs to commit to a tradition and really go deeply into it. But it's still, I think, very, very, very problematical understanding Buddhism as some kind of force that is impermeable, that is something that should be separate, that it should be something that's a cause but not itself an effect, right? In terms of its interaction with the rest of the world. I mean, frankly, it seems to me, well, there's a couple of different levels to this. As somebody who spent a lot of time studying comparative religion, I think it's important to realize, as one does if you look at, say, mystical traditions in Christianity, Islam, etc., how a lot of the insights that Buddhism is talking about are not merely the property of Buddhist teachings and practices, but there are things that happen in a lot of different other traditions. And if we really follow that through, the way I tend to see things now is that Buddhism is one language or one set of languages connected with a certain, with certain types of practices. But the notion that Buddhism has got it all and it's better than all the others, I think that's exactly what we don't need. That we need to recognize other traditions, other ways of talking too, can be very helpful to us. When you only have one tradition, when that's all that you know and all that you believe in, it becomes more difficult to distinguish the finger from the moon. If you know that metaphor, right? All the teachings, Buddhist and other spiritual teachings, they're fingers pointing at the moon. It can be very valuable, to have other fingers pointing at the moon. Otherwise, you can identify with certain ways of talking, and goodness knows I've seen this often enough, that we think the path is about learning to talk in a certain kind of way, especially something like Zen koans, and uh, learning a new language, learning a new way of relating to language. It's tricky, it's dangerous. There's a lot to be gained from the realization that the world has, so many traditions, and there's a lot of wisdom to be found in many, if not all of them. I think that's one of the fruits, of modernity. One of the main fruits of modernity is that we are now one world, like it or not, for better and worse. And we're certainly seeing that playing out on on both sides. But the fact that we now can know and do know so much about other spiritual traditions, I think that can be powerfully liberating for Buddhism and Buddhists as well. And I think that that's an essential part of how Buddhism today needs to develop. That's part of that interaction with modernity. Part of modernity is this awareness of what other spiritual traditions have to offer. The other thing I would add to it, of course, is all the other aspects of modernity, in particular science, right? And I don't just mean the physical sciences, but also social sciences. I think when you study things like psychology, abnormal psychology, sociology, anthropology, and so forth, there's a lot to be learned about social contexts and how dukkha happens and how problems arise. I'm remembering now something famously the Dalai Lama said, that if science definitively disproved some Buddhist teaching, that it would be important for Buddhism to accept that. Well, I don't know that that has happened, but I think his attitude is a really important and wonderful one. That kind of openness rather than the defensiveness, like I'm in this tradition has it all. Leave me alone. We don't have anything to learn from other people. I think that's where serious problems occur. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any other questions or angles that you would like to explore?
Yeah, well, two things, if I may. I realized number one, I left something out. I know that's amazing because I talk too much, but anyway, there was something I left out. When I was talking about sense of lack, you will notice that I was talking about individual sense of lack, right? And although you had, I think, asked about it, I didn't really talk about what might be considered collective sense of lack. Is there such a thing? Um, I made the parallel that just as we individually have this delusion of separation from each other, so we as a species now have this delusion of separation from the earth. And that too, that sense of separation, I think there's a kind of lack that goes along with that. There's a sense that we're unrooted, we're disconnected, there's something missing. Um, and I I think one of the ways that comes out very strongly has been our preoccupation with progress, kind of future orientation. If you think about it, that's something I didn't mention before, but all LAC projects are always about the future. They're always future oriented. They always take us out of the here and now. Because right now I have this sense of something missing, something isn't right. But in the future, when I get all the money or all the fame I think I need, then I'll be okay. Well, I think there's a comparable collective version of that. I think it's been our preoccupation with progress, which we have used to rationalize a lot of unfortunate, um, especially destruction of the environment in the process. We still value and we are preoccupied, yeah, with what we're going to become, and because of that, just as in Buddhism, when we're caught up in the future, we tend to overlook something really important about here and now, because our mind is attached, it's focused on other things. Yeah. one of the ways that plays out, I think, ecologically is how those of us concerned about the ecological crisis tend to bounce back and forth between hope and despair. You know, I think that's an example of that future head trip. Uh, Rather than feeling our grief right here and now, which I think is absolutely essential, but that's not a head trip. It's getting in touch with something right here and now. I once saw a monument in downtown London that simply said, "Grief is the price we pay for love." That we grieve because we love. We don't grieve if there's something we don't care for, right? And so I think it's important to feel that grief. That grief actually, it can be very helpful in some ways, in the sense of cutting through a lot of the bullshit in my life. Excuse my English there, and sort of really asking what's really important. How do I really want to live in light of the fact, as Chomsky puts it, Noam Chomsky, this is the most dangerous time in human history. That what we do or don't do in the next couple decades is going to have enormous repercussions, maybe for thousands of years. So that's one point. The second point, because I've been talking and writing about what I call Ecodharma, or ecological Buddhism, for quite a while, people occasionally ask me, what should I do? You know, they want to be an ecosattva, they want to be an ecological bodhisattva, but what should I do? Within the traditional Buddhist canons, right, the forms of Buddhism, there's no answer to that, because the problems that the Buddha and Asian Buddhists faced were quite different. There wasn't that problem with carbon emissions, etc. Of course, there's a great deal about how to do what we do, but they don't give us specific answers. And so what I've started offering in answer to that query, what should I do? I think that it's important to sort of contemplate and take one's time doing it. Contemplate three questions. Number one, what do I have to offer? Taking into account everything about my situation, my health, my skills, my networks. Am I retired? Da 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 da. What are my other responsibilities? Number two, given what I have to offer, what are the good possibilities for me? Because there are so many things, so many challenges. We can't try to do everything. We really have to focus. What might we focus on? And thirdly, having digested those first two, really, and this is where I think the meditation becomes important. What tugs at my heart? What do I really want to do? And by I don't mean just some kind of ego decision weighing up pros and cons, but getting in touch with something deeper. You could almost say, what is it that the earth wants me to do? Where, it's there. I think out of this there can come some realization about where my love, how it really wants to express itself. And I think if we do those three contemplations, and they also could be done in groups. Groups can discuss them and consider them as ways for groups to decide what to do. But I think that can be really, really important now, given that Buddhism itself isn't going to give us the specific answers, but we can use those kinds of Buddhist teachings about meditation to help us come to answer them for ourselves.
What a beautiful way of expressing the love you have for the planet, David. Thank you.
Well, thank you for these questions, because you go, the questions go into the heart of, I think, what we all need to be thinking about.
Thank you so much.